Hello, I'm Jody Robinson and happy to moderate our last session. Been a long time since I've seen Cassandra. She's going to present on landscape considerations. Please, when you have questions about this session, enter your questions into the chat. It's much more effective than when they go into the Q&A. So we'd really appreciate that. After graduating from Capital University with a BS in biology and an interest in ecology, Ms. Homan attended University of Cincinnati, where she earned her master's in biological sciences. Cassandra's focus was on invasive species ecology and research on the common wall lizard. After graduating, Casey began working on an invasive species eradication project in Claremont County, Ohio, with Davie Resource Group. She was able to gain a wide variety of experience with DRG, including working with the invasive Asian longhorned beetle, forest fire prevention, and urban forestry planning. That experience brought her to the city of Covington in 2019, where she currently has the privilege of serving as the urban forester. Cassandra, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I guess with that said, I can just hop right in unless I need to respond to raised hands. Is that something I should be doing, Jody?
You can go right ahead if you have a slideshow, or just begin whatever your presentation mode is.
All right, cool. I am going to do that then. Open this. Can you guys see that okay? Perfect. So I guess I'm just going to get right into it. I'm titled my presentation Forest Maintenance at Home, because I think that everyone is part of the ecosystem and part of the forest. So all of your landscaping really is contributing to a part of nature. And today I'm going to be focusing on managing invasive species and what some native alternatives are. I'm just going to be going through a couple of highlights before we really get into the nitty gritty of which are the good plants, quote unquote, or the bad ones. We're going to talk about what is an urban forest, what is an invasive species, why should we care about invasive species, and the history of invasive pests in trees. And then we'll get into the invasive troubleshooting and some alternatives. So first thing I wanted to mention is that your urban forest is not just your giant forested areas like Devou Park that are naturalized. The urban forest includes trees along our streets, trees in our parks and naturalized areas like along the Licking River, trees in your very own yard, and critically, these trees and even perennials like fruit pollinators can provide important habitat corridors for wildlife. So you guys are all part of that, even just by thinking of doing any kind of landscaping besides grass, really. So what next? What is an invasive species? Invasive species biology is actually a really new or relatively new field of biology. We've been learning more and more about it as we've become more connected as a society. But there is still not a lot of research out there. And so there's not a lot of an agreement. There's a lot of varying definitions on even what you would consider an invasive species, and a lot of different terms like alien and non-native, exotic, non-indigenous, biopollution, all these different terms that just add to the confusion of what does this even mean? So for today, just for this talk, when I say invasive species, I mean a non-native organism that has escaped cultivation and presents a threat to the ecosystem or our economy. There are a lot of different ways that species can do this, but I just want to be clear that we're talking about something that can really contribute in a negative way, not just to one little flower in the forest, but to us as a species and as a whole. An interesting way of looking at the possibility of an invasive species establishment is called the TENS rule. In that, so if you look at the pyramid or inverted pyramid on the right here, we have a large chunk of plant and animal species that thrive in areas that aren't native to our own. And when they come over here, they just won't survive. And then there's a smaller portion, say 10% of that original of those species that you can bring over here and they will do okay. Like maybe if you baby them, you can have them in your garden, have a lovely rose garden. And then a still smaller portion, say 10% again, of that portion that goes on to be able to become naturalized, say, and along woodlots or in unmown ditches. And then again, you take a smaller portion, 10% of those species that go on to actually have a negative impact on our ecosystem. So those are the species that we would call invasive. So overall, we're really looking at a small portion of the population, but there are a lot of important traits we can keep an eye out for to still reduce the number of invasive species that we are introducing, but still get some of the enjoyment out of some of those really exciting plant cultivars that pose no threat to our native ecosystems. So another couple of things that we can think about when we're talking about invasive species include they propose that invasive species are more likely to establish if they've been introduced multiple times. This isn't always true. For the invasive wall lizard here in Cincinnati, that was rumored to be just a single introduction, and the genetic diversity research that I did supports that. So there are instances where you can have an invasive species from a single introduction. They also say you need to have a minimum number of individuals so you can have like a critical genetic diversity / population size whenever they're introduced. Again, most of the time, but with the wall lizard, that didn't end up being true. When the species are introduced, there's often a lag period where maybe the species goes unnoticed for a long time. And then once they hit a critical threshold, you'll see their population really start to take off, kind of like a elliptical growth. And they also need suitable environment. Our native honey, or not native honeysuckle, the invasive Japanese honeysuckle, is really a great example of an invasive species that exhibits a lot of these like really aggressive traits that allow it to thrive. It has rapid growth, a short time to maturity. These bushes are producing flowers like the very first year they're in the ground, high reproduction rates, lots of berries, a lack of natural predators. The deer will sometimes eat the twigs, but in all honesty, they're probably contributing more to spread than they are reducing the population. A tolerance of a wide range of environmental conditions. These things will grow in any soil, in any crack, anywhere along riverbanks. They tolerate human interference well. They're growing in all of our backyards, excellent dispersal abilities. Birds eat the seeds and poop the seeds and spread them all over. And the ability to outcompete natives. And a lot of native species are also evolved on the mainland where there is like greater connectivity sort of in genetic diversity, as opposed to on islands where you have a lot more limited genetic pool that you're dealing with. So why care? Like, yes, invasive species are a thing, but I hear this question a lot. Like, if invasive species are so aggressive, maybe this is the way that our natural ecosystem is supposed to go. Evolution, survival of the fittest. And I hear that, but there are a lot of reasons that we should care. The biggest reason being that they outcompete and displace a lot of our native species. So a really good example of this, just continuing with the honeysuckle idea, is that honeysuckle leaves out well before basically everything else in our forest. And so right at the time of year when we should have a bunch of ephemeral flowers blooming in our forest understories, the honeysuckle is shading them out and they don't get the opportunity to bloom. And those ephemeral flowers in the understories are important resources for our early pollinators. And so that's all connected. Overall, they just reduce biological diversity. So that can make us more susceptible in the long run to potential changes from climate and other like pests type things. Invasive species cost the US about 120 billion annually. A lot of that comes from the cost that cities like Covington incur trying to treat ash trees. But a lot of that cost is also being incurred to our farmers. They have to spend a lot of extra money staying on top of some of these pests, and see reduced yield. And that cost can be translated onto us, the consumer. And so you can see where it would be easy to get up to about 120 billion annually. Invasive species are the second greatest threat to endangered and threatened species, just behind habitat degradation. And even here, locally, we can see how invasive species are actively changing our forest ecology. While I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to hear about the research from a bunch of brilliant people. And some of our local students at UC who were there at the same time as me were doing research on mice habitat and cedar waxwing birds. The cedar waxwing that you see here has that beautiful yellow tip, which the males use to entice the females to begin breeding. The more colorful the tip, the more likely the male is to get picked. But now that honeysuckle is so prevalent, they have begun foraging more on the berry, and the dyes from the berries are beginning to show up in their tail tips, which makes their tail tips a little bit more orange and a little bit brighter and even more exciting to the females. So that is having probably a direct impact on the evolutionary track that this bird is going to go on. They're going to perhaps alternately select for other birds who prefer to eat honeysuckle because it produces a brighter tip. The other research that one of my colleagues was doing was on mice foraging in the understory. They actually found an increase in mice populations because the honeysuckle shaded out some of their predators. And so the predators were no longer able to see the mice, and the mice felt more safe. So just one more thing about why we should care. This is pretty much what our native forest understory should look like kind of dark and cool feeling, shady, pretty wide open. So you have room for all those ground pollinator plants in the spring. But this is what a lot of our forests do look like with the honeysuckle. So you can imagine how that has a huge impact just on the feel if you're going for a hike. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that invasive species like honeysuckle just don't produce the same kind of benefits that native tree species do. Trees can help reduce your electric bills by shading your house. Honeysuckle doesn't generally get tall enough to shade your house. Larger trees are better at reducing the amounts of pollutants reduced from the air. They bring money into economic districts. They reduce the amount of crime in areas, increase property values. Trees have deeper roots than honeysuckle does, and so therefore are better stabilizers of hillside and preventing erosion than honeysuckle. I mean, literally, I could go on about this all day, but it's not supposed to be a presentation just about trees, even though for a minute I'm going to make it one. I'm sorry, forestry, I have to do it. So I just think this is helpful to understand how we can sort of combat invasive species in the future. So just a highlight of invasive pests in trees, the chestnut blight came in early 1900s. It's a fungal pathogen, wiped out all of these enormous trees that had a super broad range. You can see in the map here across North America. They were a huge portion of our forest and very quickly got completely wiped out. Similarly, in the 1930s, we had Dutch elm disease come through, also a fungal pathogen, and was transmitted by a beetle. And you can see again here, the elms that it affects are very broadly distributed across North America. And it very quickly wiped out a large portion of our elm trees. And these trees were used very broadly across the United States as a common street tree. So there are a lot of areas that lost all of their trees and didn't have a lot to come back with. So they decided to replant with ash trees. And then we heard pretty much the same story, right? It's a beautiful tree. They were broadly planted. They occurred broadly throughout the United States. A beetle was introduced in early 2000s, and these things, the ash trees, within a few years, we were losing millions and millions across the United States. This beetle is Asiatic origin. I'm sorry, I did not include the map on this. I did also want to include a little bit extra about this, just because we are a little bit still dealing with this beetle. So just in case you guys have not made a plan, it is probably something good to keep an eye out and consider if you have ash trees on your property. You can see this little emerald ash borer here, pretty distinctive little bug, has a flat head. It belongs to the flathead borers family, so that's why you see the D-shaped holes. It lays its eggs along the tree, and then the larvae eat through the cambium and phloem layers of the tree, producing this like serpentine type serpentine type pattern in the wood. You often see a lot of blonding, like on this bark here, that's just kind of sloughed off, and thinning canopy in the trees whenever it starts to get further along in the ash tree life cycle. So all of that to say that there's a long history of invasive pests in trees, but they all seem to have a couple of things in common. One is that these trees are widely distributed, often even in monoculture along some streets. These trees are all from genre, as in like ash trees being a genus, or maple trees being a genus. They're all from genera with a lot of species. So there are a lot of different ash trees across the world. And then those ash trees also span the globe. So there are a lot of ash trees from the time when the continents were connected in Pangea, and then they split apart. And so they were able to diverge into their own species, but they're all still connected as a genus. And so the other thing I like to point out with invasive pests in trees is that they have to have this triangle, I guess, of things to actually produce a disease and be considered invasive, right? Because otherwise, we have non-native insects coming over here probably far more often than any of us realize, but not everyone is going to produce a disease like emerald ash borer that is so devastating to our communities. So you need a susceptible host and the introduced community. You need the pathogen, which sometimes is just eating through the phloem, or in the case of the Dutch elm disease, as an actual fungus. And then you need a conducive environment. You need the right temperature and moisture levels to keep moving forward, right? So all that to say, invasive species can really, really be devastating. So what can we do? There is really no one right way for managing your invasive species, because each invasive species is going to react differently in the environment and have different implications and seriousness. So you just have to really consider them separately. You have to consider the timing. So if you look at your invasive species now, say you have one honeysuckle bush on the hill behind your house, can you keep it to one honeysuckle bush on the hill, or is it going to take up your entire backyard? What is the risk associated with doing nothing? Sometimes that might depend on your personal goals. If you have goals of having a giant flower garden, letting your English ivy get out of control could choke out all your flowers. But if you just want a ground cover, as long as you keep your English ivy from becoming destructive, maybe it's okay. Um, and integrated pest management just means that I guess a lot of people think that the only way to solve a pest is an herbicide. And you can see over on the top left, yes, we have chemical controls for pest management, but there are other solutions too. Biological controls, monitoring, like just keeping an eye out for invasive species, because if you see just one, it can be easy to get rid of early. Cultural controls, that would be like us having a conversation today and educating about invasive species and saying that this is a priority in our community. Physical controls, just us pulling it out of the ground with our hands. And I think, oh man, I didn't include my favorite biological control, which is goats. So adorable. And so the first thing I want to say about managing invasive species is that prevention is so much more powerful than trying to respond to the invasion. And the best tool we have for prevention is planting diverse species. Because as we've seen with things like the ash tree, you can have a beautiful ash lined street like this. And if ash is all you plant and you have something devastating like emerald ash borer come in, pretty soon this is what it looks like. And now no one has a shade tree in that portion of the street. And so what we recommend, at least with street trees, and I think this is probably a good rule to follow also in our flower gardens, is plant no more than 10% of a species. So a species would be something specific like sugar maple, and then no more than 20% of a genus, which would be any maples, and then no more than 30% of a family, which an example would be maples and buckeyes are part of the Sapindaceae family. A lot of people actually recommend a lot more stringent guidelines than that 10% of one species. And in fact, my goal for our street tree diversity in Covington is to have no more than 5% eventually, but we have a long way to go with that because we have a lot of invasive calorie pear trees we need to remove here. Other things to keep in mind, just to be like on the prevention side of invasive species, are never empty out an aquarium or terrarium or a house plant into the wild unless you know for sure that this is a plant that belongs here. Don't move invasive species. This sounds obvious, but those little wall lizards I studied, I heard a dozen stories about how people would bring them to their gardens because they thought they were just so cute. Don't move firewood. I really can't stress this enough. Always burn your firewood where you plan to burn it, or buy it where you plan to burn it. Between outdoor trips, you want to clean off your gear, your boots. A lot of times, if you guys have ever been down to, say, Mammoth Cave and toward the caves down there, they'll take you through a little brushy sponges afterwards to clean your feet off because they don't want any chance of you transporting either seeds or the fungus, the chytrid is it a chytrid? It's a geomyces destruction fungus, that white nose fungus that affects bats' noses. So really important to think about that if you go through an area that has some sort of invasive pest. Don't release any plants or animals into the wild unless they are from that wild. Clean your boat and any boating equipment before you enter a new area. This is especially important if you've been in an area that has blue-green algae in lakes, which is really common in a lot of areas that have agricultural runoff. Don't plant invasive species. It's a really good preventative tool. There are a lot of good alternatives. And I'll share with you guys a website where you can go to check for all of the Kentucky invasive plants later, so you can be sure too. And then also just spread the word. If you're in your friend's yard and you see something, you don't have to be a jerk about it, but you can be like, hey, that's an interesting plant. Do you know what that is? I can help you with it. So just some more trouble. So we're going to actually get into, I guess, the meat and potatoes of troubleshooting now. If you still have ash trees, I did want to take a second to talk about this. It would be a good time to look at your trees and assess whether they are a hazard, because I would be surprised if there isn't some damage already if you haven't proactively been treating. Options for dealing with emerald ash borer are, there are a lot of chemical options, which I list here briefly, with different levels of effectiveness, and we don't need to go into that right now, but just keep an eye on your ash trees and make sure you're assessing. We're starting to see native species recognize the emerald ash borer as a prey item, so that's pretty cool. And whether or not you treat your ash tree is really up to you, because depending on the level of decay, you might decide that it's really not worth treating anymore. So you see this little chart on the right is basically allowing you to compare canopy dieback. You see this first one on the upper left has a really nice full canopy. The light's not really getting through in a lot of areas. And then 10% dieback all the way down. I would say once you're starting to look at 40% dieback, I would consider maybe that tree is not worth spending the chemical on anymore. and 50% dieback, you would definitely need to start thinking like about removal. I mean, that's just a general area, no set in stone, but as a guideline. There's also a bunch of tools out there right now that can help you decide if you think the money is worth it. Because, in all honesty, if your tree is already, say, 30-40% along in the canopy dieback, maybe you're farther ahead removing it and replacing with a new tree that can gain more canopy over the next 10-20 years than you just sticking more money and chemical into this tree. So the Urban Tree Alliance has a nice calculator where you can just put the circumference of your tree in, and then it even gives you like the amount of time where the benefits and treatment outweigh each other. It's pretty cool. Dutch elm disease is another common tree disease, but it's like a lot the same as the ash. You can choose to treat it if it's a really important tree to you, or you can choose to take it down and replace it with something that maybe needs a little bit less attention, depending on where that tree is in its cycle of decline. The other thing to keep in mind with the Dutch elm disease is it can be less likely to be transmitted if you just keep your elm pruning to the winter, because the fungus is often transmitted by this beetle. If the beetle is not active, it can't be transmitting the fungus. And there are also a lot of elm trees that are now disease resistant. So I just urge you to consider, like, Princeton elm is a American elm cultivar that is really resistant. Whereas some of the other ones, these are all good. Jefferson, Valley Forge. Lace bark elm is on the invasive species watch list for Kentucky. So I do urge a little bit of caution with that, but I think that's sort of a personal preference situation too. The Asian longhorn beetle is the first invasive species I worked on after graduating, and is right over the river in Claremont County, Ohio. There are a huge number of genus of trees that can be susceptible to this beetle, including maples, buckeyes, willows, elms. You guys see the list there. I haven't ever seen it on a hackberry, katsura, sycamore, like really anything after the poplars. I haven't actually seen it on. But that doesn't mean, like, these are all trees that they were seen on in the lab setting. So I think for this is like, just keep your eye out. Here's a picture of the beetle. It has really long antenna, hence the name longhorned beetle, and with like really light blue markings on its legs and antenna. And then there are some pictures of the on the top right is the ovipositioning site. So you see like their little chew marks on the sides. And then the top or the bottom right is their exit holes, which is like pretty much a hole straight out. It really reminds me a lot of the cicada holes we've been seeing, except it's coming out of wood instead of the soil. You also see some of these gallery type damage on the tree. So just recognize the signs because it is kind of close by. And so if you see something like this, report it to the Kentucky USDA, or the extension office would probably be a good resource too. Don't move firewood. I'm going to say this so many times, but just like for real, don't move firewood. There's also an invasive thousand cankers disease, which is affecting our walnuts. This is not as big a deal as we were thinking it was going to be a couple years ago, back when it was discovered in like 2010, I think, in Tennessee. They thought everybody was in a panic pretty much. But for whatever reason, it hasn't spread yet. So again, just know the signs. You can see they have really tiny holes, and sometimes there's a little bit of staining associated with those holes. And don't move firewood. Beech leaf disease is something going on more in the northeast, but again, something good to look out for. You see these like little darkening and like maybe like a tiny bit of puckering in between the leaf veins on beech leaves. It does sometimes lead to total tree mortality. And they're associating it with a nematode, but they still don't know the mechanism of how it's hurting the trees, I guess. So if you just see something like this, report it to maybe your local urban forester like me or your extension office. Oak wilt is another good one to keep an eye out for. This can be transported by rhododendrons if it can be infected there too. So be careful if you're buying rhododendrons that aren't grown like locally. And it's another good one where if you can just uh, prune only in the wintertime on oaks is a good preventive tool because of the beetles that are associated with it. And also know that this is one that can actually spread through the root system. So if you see it, you really want to get on top of it early. You see like curling on the leaves. There are a lot of oak diseases though, so this is a really good one to like really evaluate thoroughly before you jump to your oak tree having oak wilt, right? So there's probably a million different galls that can grow on oak. They can be sensitive to nutrient deficiencies. Um, so if you have questions about any of your tree diagnoses, you can always send that to the each extension agency should have a horticultural specialist who can help you with diagnosing both soil nutrient deficiencies and plant disease problems, which I highly recommend. I use that resource all the time. This is another one that we should just keep an eye out for. This spotted lanternfly has been, again, sort of more in the Northeast, but it's starting to make its way across West Virginia and parts of Ohio and has a really broad range of pests, especially across agriculture, including hops and grapes and apples, which would really affect a lot of our alcohol and liquor industry, and as well as important lumber and fruit trees. So you see this bug here is the adult, but they will lay their eggs on just about anything. These pictures in the middle with these like sort of whitish grayish masses, that's what their egg masses look like, but they could be laid on vehicles, on buckets, on railroad tires, spikes, like just it's not just limited to trees. So what I say is if you're traveling through the area, just keep an eye out for these little guys. And also one of their preferred hosts is tree of heaven, which is another invasive species. So if you have tree of heaven on your property, it might not be a bad idea to preventively get rid of it and remove a host for this guy. So what do we do about all these? Like we're keeping an eye out for these pests on trees, but what about plants, right? A lot of times what I recommend is like go heavy on the monitoring portion of the integrated pest management part, right? So I just spotted a bit of wild parsnip by the office. And I know that if I remove it now, I can stop the infestation from getting out of control. So that is really what I do recommend is as much as you can hand pull and follow up with monitoring. If you can't, a 3% glyphosate mix will be pretty good on a lot of these really tough, aggressive invasive species, because otherwise the lower concentrations, they don't always respond to like that lower concentration of Roundup. So 3% glyphosate is just a little bit more concentrated Roundup, basically. And also keep in mind, if you have any creeks or wetlands or koi ponds or any type of water that runs close to your property, you want to make sure you get a wetland friendly product. And so another thing is that like some of these plant species are like almost like they are built to resist killing. Honeysuckle is a really good one in that if you cut it, which is a really great way to get rid of it, if you don't come back and spray that stump within say 15 minutes, it can sort of seal itself off, and then the chemical won't even absorb down to the root system. And so you'll still be dealing with it next year, unfortunately. So if you're dealing with honeysuckle, princess tree or paulownia or tree of heaven, especially those, I do recommend, like, if it's too big for you to hand pull it and you have to cut and treat, that you cut and treat promptly to actually be effective. And if you have like a lot of ground cover, you might like winter creeper, for example. That's one that if you don't want to hand pull all of that, that's 100% understandable. But if you still want to get rid of it, you might want to like try weed whacking it first before spraying it, because a lot of times, or a surfactant would help too, if anybody's familiar with surfactants, because otherwise the chemical just doesn't super soak into the leaves. But I think really weed whacking, it's the easiest option there. Oh, here's the picture of the goats. We have used those. If you have a really bad infestation, I mean, if you have the opportunity to rent goats, highly recommend. They are very effective invasive species management tools because they will eat everything. And they're very friendly. Also, I would say if the invasive species you're removing is a tree, even though it's invasive, it still has a couple benefits. So you might want to consider replacing it, because trees are a community resource. And especially if you live on a hillside, honeysuckle roots are shallow, but they're contributing. Native plants are so better stabilizers though. So if you can replace that honeysuckle with a native tree or a native bush, all the better. So this is the portion where I want to get into some invasive plant alternatives. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we're getting close to the end here. Kudzu, I'm not offering an alternative here. I just want you guys to know what it looks like and that it can take over really quickly. I mean, we're talking about a vine that can grow multiple feet every day. So if you see this, it kind of almost looks like poison ivy because it has that 3-leaf pattern, but the edges are very different. If you see this, you'll want to get on top of it right away. I grouped these together, porcelain berry here on the top, Asian bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle vine. Again, if you see these, I would say you want to get on top of those pretty quickly. They're pretty aggressive. They're all beautiful vines that have berries. Some alternatives, though, would be this trumpet honeysuckle vine, which is a native and a big favorite of hummingbirds. This is raccoon grape, I believe, which I thought looked very similar to the porcelain berry, if that's a look you were going for. This is the American bittersweet version, which I think is actually almost a threatened species or something. You don't see a lot of this. And then this isn't honestly, it doesn't look anything like the rest of these, but I had to throw it in because it's a Kentucky vine and it's so beautiful. Passion flower vine. If you're thinking about a vine, I mean, you got to consider passion flower vine. Calorie pear, please. I know it's not illegal to plant a calorie pear yet, but these Bradford aristocrat and Cleveland pears that you see everywhere are becoming a bigger and bigger pain. You can see that they will inhabit just about any area that's not regularly mown and is along a forest. So there are a lot of great alternatives. I mean, honestly, any tree you want would be great, but if you're looking for that white flowering look, you might include American plum, a flowering dogwood, which is one of my favorites, or a Kentucky yellowwood. So Kentucky, the first two here, the American plum and the flowering dogwood, are typically smaller growing trees and will flower really close to the beginning of the spring. And then this Kentucky yellowwood would be closer in size to your calorie pear, like more of a medium sized tree. And then it blooms after it leaves out. So the flowers aren't quite as showy, but they're small and bell shaped and super cute. So I still really like that. Oh goodness. Oh no. Really like that cultivar. Purple loosestrife is another one that sometimes people plant, but you might consider a blue lobelia, which is a variant of our native cardinal lobelia, or a blazing star. Another one, invasive plants we see, winter creeper and English ivy. These are ones that like I'm a little bit on the fence about. They're a little out of control and I don't like them personally, but if they're not in your way, I guess it's okay. With the exception, I will say, don't let them go up your trees because one, these add a lot of weight to your trees, and trees are only growing to support their own weight. So it can add risk to your trees for failure. And the other part of that is if you see this picture of the winter creeper on the left, it has little fruits on it. It only gets these little fruits when it climbs up onto vertical spaces. So it can also reproduce at a faster rate if it's going up the tree. So we don't need any of that. Instead, you could plant some wild ginger, which I think is one of the most underrated flowers in the forest. Has this really cute, like brownish flower and gets nice little thick heart-shaped leaves. Or you might consider some kind of sedge, native sedge. I think this is Pennsylvania sedge. Lesser celandine is a really big one that we see in a lot of people's yards and has naturalized to a lot of our native woodlands too. If you see this in your yard, again, it's all personal choice. There is no right or wrong answer, but I wouldn't want this to get out of control because it gets really, really aggressive really fast. Instead, if you like the yellow flowers, you might consider tickweed or coreopsis, or wood poppies. I've only seen these in the woods actually around here once, and it was about the most magical experience there can be. These are gorgeous. Burning bush is another popular invasive species. I'm starting to see it pop along some of our edges along Davao. So I'm encouraging people not to plant any more burning bush and instead consider native alternatives like the strawberry bush, which is just a native euonymus. So the burning bush is a euonymus, and this is the native version, which gets these like gorgeous fruits on it, which I think is the real advantage of the strawberry bush. It doesn't get the same fall color quite as the burning bush, but if you're looking for spectacular fall color, then might I recommend our native black gum tree, also called Tupelo. Never mind that mulch volcano on this tree. These guys get amazing fall color, super vibrant bright red. So if that's what you're looking for, I would definitely go with one of those. Japanese barberry, I've also started encountering these at some of our state parks locally. They're thorny, so it's pretty annoying. Some alternatives for that would include arrowwood. I'm actually looking at getting one of these from Nature this fall personally because they're gorgeous. Bayberry or winterberry holly. But if you're gonna go with because hollies have that like great sort of spiky feeling leaves sometimes because they're thicker. And I feel like they really are the most similar. But if you go with a holly, I would recommend testing your soil first because I think they do prefer a little bit more acidic soil. And that's another service that the extension office can do for you. Honeysuckle, our most popular invasive plant, has so many alternatives. Honestly, our native button bush, I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to plant this because this adorable flower. And then also our native spice bush. This is one of my favorites too. It has these cute little yellow flowers, and then the foliage is really, because it's related to our sassafras, if you crunch the leaves, it has a really nice like citrusy type smell. Siberian elm, this is beginning to come up more and more in our urban areas that are becoming naturalized. Again, I think the answer to an invasive Siberian elm is obvious. Plant an American elm. We mentioned the Princeton earlier. Tree of Heaven is hugely out of control. And again, is one of the host species for the spotted lanternfly, which is as close as West Virginia and Ohio right now. It has this like giant compound leaf, and it grows really quickly with this like spongy type pith on the inside of the twig. So if you see this kind of long compound leaf structure and it doesn't look like a walnut to you, and you break open one of the twigs, if it breaks really easily because of this giant sponginess, you might have a tree of heaven. And it also kind of smells like a bit like burnt peanut butter. No one is talking about this smelling good. But anyway, keep an eye out for this tree and try to get rid of it early if you can. Alternatives in my mind are basically anything else because I've never heard of anyone planting this tree on purpose. But if you're really into the compound leaf look, maybe a walnut, as long as you don't mind the big fruit, or a sumac, as long as you don't mind them getting a little wild. These, again, are ones I'm not going to offer alternatives for, but I do want to just point out that they exist because these are a little bit dangerous. So on the left, the far left and the far right, we have wild parsnip and giant hogweed. These are both invasive species that have chemicals in there that are produced, like if you rub up on them and get them on your skin and then are exposed to sunlight, it can result in what is like a chemical burn. I had the misfortune of running into wild parsnip, which is supposed to be the friendlier, I guess, of the two, with giant hogweed being really, really terrible. And it was still, not a great experience. And then this middle picture is of poison hemlock. You're not gonna some people do break out in rashes from this one, but the other thing is this is also poisonous. So if you have any pasture type animals, anything where there's any chance of this being consumed, you'll want to get rid of it. So these are all in the carrot family. They're all related to Queen Anne's lace. But these are the ones that you really need to watch out for: wild parsnip, poison hemlock, and giant hogweed. Another invasive tree is our princess tree or Paulownia. This grows really, really fast, really, really quickly, and sends shoots off of its roots. So I wouldn't let it hang around. A good alternative is the northern catalpa, though. It gets really similar, like giant heart-shaped leaves, but is theoretically in range at least. Another invasive species is the multiflora rose. I've ran into this in forests a lot too. Again, I think there are a lot of really great alternatives, including our blackberry, which is really similar and has the advantage of producing delicious fruit, or the California or Carolina rose, excuse me. And as promised, I wanted to include some of these resources. So we've got stuff about emerald ash borer if you're still curious about that. More things about not moving firewood, direct connections for the Kenton, Boone, Campbell, what?
Oh, sorry, keep going.
Kenton, Boone, and Campbell extension offices. And then this link here, the SE-EPPC, that is for the Kentucky Invasive Plant Council website. And then the link right below it is the direct link to their current list of all Kentucky invasive species. And then one other thing that I think is helpful, especially for beginning gardeners, is having an app like iNaturalist or Seek to like help you get close to a species ID. I don't recommend it for like relying for sure, like, but you can say, okay, this is a species of honeysuckle, or this is a species of maple tree, and then look at other key IDs to help you be sure that you got the right one. But that can be a really helpful tool for finding those invasive species when you're new. And hopefully I saved time for questions.
At this point, Cassandra, we do not have any questions in our chat. Super informative. This will be available online in the near future. We'll let everyone know. So thank you so much for the presentation. Everyone online, look for our survey. We will be sending you a constant contact email because your feedback's really important. Plus, we'll be announcing our winners of the Scott Sidler giveaways. So thanks for joining us. Follow us on Facebook, and our website will also have updates. Thanks so much. Bye.